Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking a look at a fairly charged and emotional issue of Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men, and that is issue 196. I do want to preface that this is a controversial issue not only because of the subject matter being addressed in a way more overt way than usual, but also because Claremont gets a little too heavy-handed with the mutant metaphor in here and has a character use a real-world slur on page, and while his intention was to likely connect mutant persecution with real systems of oppression, it's really messy in execution and was a poor choice in my opinion. That being said, I still think this is a great issue at its core and there is a lot we can take away from it. We open on Charles Xavier, who is giving a lecture at Columbia University where he's an adjunct professor, and he's suddenly been hit with this sharp psychic intrusion from picking up the thought of someone in the classroom. And the thought is so alarming because it's somewhat an admission of guilt, saying that this person did something wrong, and because someone knows they did something wrong, that person has to die. But Charles Xavier doesn't have any more information than that. And for context, usually Charles Xavier could just use his powers to sort of brute force figure out who had that thought, but currently he is in an injured state, he's recovering, and he's unable to do that. He's more just a radio receiving a signal right now, unable to manipulate it. We then get a later scene where Professor Xavier and the X-Men are out having a lunch, Magneto included, as he's on mostly good terms with the team at this point, and Professor Xavier brings the X-Men up to speed on the fact that he's worried one of his students is planning on committing murder. A few important things about this scene, the first being Kitty calls out Magneto, sort of lamenting about how they're so chummy with him at the moment despite him having almost killed her recently, and that is in reference to issue 150, which I also have an analysis video on, so if you want to check that out, it's a great issue. But Magneto acknowledges to Lee Forrester that he's given them good reason to distrust him in the past, and his ownership of that is certainly a big step in Magneto's growth and will be crucial later in this issue when, surprisingly, Magneto becomes the moral stabilizer of the X-Men. We also see Professor Xavier lie to the team here. He tells them he can't use his telepathic abilities to easily probe for the perpetrator because he's conducting a delicate experiment where he's taken something that is neutralizing his telepathic abilities. Rachel Summers, an immensely powerful telepath, immediately recognizes this as a lie because she can sense his mental shields intact and working. In fact, it seems like everybody has the sense that this is a lie, but they kind of just brush it off. I guess Charles is saying this because he doesn't want them to see weakness in him, and he doesn't want them to worry about him. Following this, their waiter comes to the table and sees the newspaper that is laid out there with the headline about Nimrod, the anti-mutant killing machine that has been plaguing our X-Men, and this is a pretty massive thematic beat that Claremont is trying to show us here, the casual human celebration of a mutant killing entity and just the general normalization of anti-mutant violence. Claremont likely trying to make a parallel to police brutality, state-sanctioned violence, and just, I guess in general, media narratives that dehumanize others. Rachel Summers then gets distracted when a strange man with a strong energy passes by and enters a nearby deli. Rachel then approaches the man who we know is the Beyonder, but when Kitty joins her eventually, he's vanished and nowhere to be seen. I think something here that is super interesting for Rachel's character, and I may be reading it incorrectly, but I believe that she initially had that interest because the Beyonder is in a current form that kind of looks like the adult version of Franklin Richards, who, from Rachel Summers' original Days of Future Past timeline, she was in love with that Franklin Richards. And we're going to start seeing the breadcrumbs being dropped for how emotionally charged Rachel is going to be later on in this issue, because she's sort of seeing reminders of the terrible future that she lived and kind of the alarm bells going off that this present is going to be ending up that way too if they don't change something. We then cut to Columbia University, late at night under the cover of darkness as a group of students has infiltrated Xavier's campus office, and radical thought has become radical action here as one of them pulls out this metal device and implants it within Charles Xavier's desk. Turns out it is an improvised explosive, and once they're finished planting it, we get from one of them, "It's done, the mutie is as good as dead." And this is sort of a dark subject that this issue attempts to shine a light on. The threat here is very ordinary. These radicalized terrorists really are not superhuman, they're not the Hellfire Club, they're not Sentinels, they're just college students. And I think there's a lot of truth to showing that, a terrible future doesn't necessarily begin with something so flamboyant as an evil supervillain. It begins with ordinary people convincing themselves that someone else's life has less value. We then see Rachel Summers and Rogue flying over the campus using Rachel's telepathic abilities to probe for any leads, which, as we learn, was Magneto's suggestion, which prompts a conversation about his turn from villain to good guy. And as Rogue points out, she can't really critique too harshly because she herself started as a villain. As for Rachel's perspective, from her original timeline, Magneto was a hero who took Professor Xavier's place after he was slaughtered, and Magneto led the X-Men in that universe. This is just another sad reminder of her future and the trauma that she had to endure, and Rogue tries to comfort her by pointing out that that future has not happened yet, and maybe it won't. But they're interrupted as Rachel gets a psychic ping that someone below them is being mugged, and as they quickly go down to take care of this, they're treated apprehensively by the man they just rescued from 3 criminals, and that's because he clocks them as mutants. And what was he doing right before he was mugged? Well, he was graffitiing some anti-mutant rhetoric on the alleyway wall. And again, we're getting some of the thesis here. It doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter who you save. If hate is the framework of your opposition, if propaganda has seeped so much into their worldview that it just completely corrupts them, gratitude is not gonna really override that prejudice. And Rachel just completely snaps at this, understandably so. She tells Rogue to open her eyes and that everything she's endured, all of those horrors, are repeating themselves in just a different way. She's already watched everyone she loves die once, and she's not gonna let it happen again. With that, she uses a burst of psychic energy to completely obliterate the hateful graffiti off of the wall. And while the writing is gone, unfortunately, her own pain and trauma is still there, and it's not so easy to get rid of as the graffiti. We then cut to a pretty fun tonal pivot in this issue. It's this small quiet moment between Kitty Pryde and Wolverine, where they're sitting on the campus steps. And this starts off with Wolverine smoking a cigar and Kitty asking if she can try it, or really kind of demanding so. Kitty Pryde takes a puff and immediately starts coughing up a lung. It's such a funny moment, and I really like the expression that John Romita Jr. drew her as having. I just always laugh when I look at this panel. But then again, we get characters talking about Magneto and what his place in the X-Men is currently and if he should be trusted. And Wolverine is basically on Magneto's side here. He thinks that Magneto is trying to make a difference and change, and that aligns with what we know about Wolverine's arc and his beliefs as well. He believes people can grow because he himself has had to grow, and his entire arc is about choosing to be better than what he was made to be anyway. They also share concern over Charles Xavier clearly lying about the abilities that he currently has right now with telepathy, and just how injured he really might be, but Wolverine points out that Charles Xavier has done so much for them, they owe him so much, and so at this point they may as well trust him to go through with what he thinks is best. Kitty ends up kind of agreeing with Wolverine here, and she says then she has to go because she's got this next group of suspects that she wants to go investigate. And this is where we're going to sort of get into the messy part of the issue, because Kitty phases into one of the buildings on campus. She slips through the doors using her powers as she always does, and she ends up entering one of the labs in the building where a group of students are sort of huddled and grouped together. These are of course the anti-mutant radicals who planted the explosive in Charles Xavier's desk. But to Kitty, this is not an immediately alarming situation. She can tell there's some tension in the air, but she's not quite sure why, because these are students that she knows and would not consider to be murderers. But the group's ringleader, who is notably black, that is important, starts to piece together that Kitty Pryde herself must be a mutant, and he calls her a mutie, the sort of in-world derogatory term for mutants. And she fires back with what is the most controversial line of this whole issue, where she basically asks him if he considers himself a racial slur, and she just flat out says it. Now, she's trying to obviously make him recognize that mutie is not harmless and it isn't funny, and he wouldn't himself like to be treated in a derogatory sense. But this is just really messy, and I don't think it quite works. Claremont is a white writer. You using a real anti-black slur with a huge history behind it, inserted inside his fictional universe as an oppression metaphor, spoken through the mouthpiece of a white Jewish teenager to make a point about mutants. I just really think the metaphor could have easily paralleled racism without needing to quote the exact language of racial terror. So for me, the intention is good, but the execution is not. I'd be curious what others think about this moment. The group of students eventually overpower Kitty as she's calling out their cowardice. They mace her and they chloroform her. We then cut back to the Columbia's campus steps where Wolverine is still smoking his cigar, except now he's joined by Colossus and Rogue. And notably here, Rogue is lamenting about the encounter she just had with the graffitiing bigot. And she expresses this sense of alienation sort of by saying, I don't know if I'd be any worse off if I stayed with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. She is getting exhausted of being good in a world that refuses to see you as good and refuses to see you for the totality of your actions. And it really starts to bring up this interesting conversation of how she openly kind of admits that prejudiced people make her stop caring in a sense. It's not noble to her, it doesn't feel noble to save a man who wants you dead. It feels humiliating. We then see Rachel Summers standing with Charles and Magneto in Charles Xavier's office, trying to make sense of a strange psychic presence that she's been feeling, the one she saw earlier, which we know is the Beyonder, and for the first time she puts it into words for them. And as they're having this conversation about the Beyonder himself appears, and Rachel immediately forms a psi link between the three of them so they can all perceive the Beyonder directly, because otherwise only she could see him at the moment. But the instant that she does that, the psychic energy she's channeling triggers the device that was planted in Charles Xavier's desk, because it is not a conventional explosive, but it is a psionic amplifier designed to seize any nearby telepathic energy, magnify it 100-fold, and fire it straight back into the mind that launched it. And this basically overloads every nerve she has, every psychic receptor she has, and every trauma scar that she has in her mind. This also temporarily amplifies her abilities even further, and because of that, she is able to sense Kitty's terror coming from a nearby location, and she just completely snaps here. Her appearance shifts instantly, her costume morphing into the gear that she wore in her dystopian timeline, and even the tattoos reappearing on her face. This is Hound Rachel, the enslaved mutant tracker she was forced to become from the Days of Future Past timeline. A strong visual representation to show that she is literally becoming the version of herself shaped by genocide and trauma. She burst out of there in this telekinetic fury, launching herself towards the direction of Kitty Pryde. Wolverine having also bursted in and taking note of this, trying to get Rachel to stop and calm down for a second, but to no avail. And then we see what's going on with Kitty at the moment, which she's being choked by the ringleader of the extremist students, and one of the other students even hesitates, and there's some fear coming through, and they say, don't do it, please, for heaven's sake. But the ringleader dismisses that, saying it's too late for second thoughts, and because the explosion just went off, that means Xavier is gone, and they won't be safe until all witnesses are disposed of. But as his grip tightens around her throat and life is waning from Kitty, Rachel Summers bursts into the room, this really awesome telekinetic panel where her rage is exemplified in a very visually satisfying way. The student extremists end up scattered around the floor like rag dolls, and Kitty begins crawling towards Rachel. To Rachel's surprise and relief, she made it in time. She can sense a heartbeat, and she can sense Kitty's thoughts, as she puts it, as wonderfully normal and chaotic as ever. But the ringleader, who is also on the floor at this point, pulls out his gun and aims it right at Rachel Summers and fires. This hardly even phases Rachel, as you can't take a telepath by surprise, as she says, and she catches the bullet with her telekinesis and curves it right back at him, and the only reason the bullet does not go right through the back of his skull is because somebody stops it, and that somebody is Magneto. This is such a wonderful moment in the issue, and it's such an intense moment too, because while they have the conversation that precedes this, Magneto and Rachel are basically in a stalemate with this bullet. Rachel is trying all she can to push it forward into the perpetrator's head. Magneto is trying as hard as he can to hold it back. And Magneto pleads with Rachel, begging her not to go through with this. But Rachel says it's no less than they would have done to us and they deserve more. And with that, she lashes out, telepathically slamming all of the students with a psychic attack, fueled by her trauma and rage and fury. But Magneto's real intention intervening here is not just to physically save this human, it's to philosophically save Rachel Summers, really, to save her soul. And this is where I'm saying things have kind of flipped here for the X-Men, because Rachel Summers right now is sort of in the place of being a violent revolutionary, whereas Magneto, the one who has typically adopted that role, is becoming the restraining moral force. And this is just a phenomenal self-aware character moment for Magneto, where he's also empathetically, like I said, trying to save Rachel Summers' soul. He lists out that, this was what I once believed in too, and look at what I achieved. I'm hated, I'm feared, I'm associated with madness and evil, I'm estranged from my children, and worst of all, I sought to make the world a better place for my people, and in doing so, I have almost certainly made it worse for them. But really, Rachel is struggling with a confession that this psychic attack has sort of pulled out of her, which is that when she was in her era, she was a hound that was forced to hunt mutants, and she killed people she knew, and some people she loved. So she's not just angry here, she's also deeply ashamed, and this violence is a mix of all of that. It's a reaction to guilt and pain, and she wants these students to die, not just for Kitty, but because they remind her of the humans who enslaved her in killing her own people. And then Magneto takes this to its sort of logical conclusion and says, well, then kill him. Prove your superiority. And this is not Magneto encouraging her to kill him, really, but it's Magneto forcing Rachel to confront the truth that killing this guy would mean becoming the weapon her oppressors designed her to be and believe her to be. It means cementing their worldview in truth. It means being the Hound again. And with that, Rachel drops the bullet, allowing a little bit of mercy on these student extremists. But she tells Magneto, I may never forgive you for this. Because in truth, he may have saved her soul, but in doing so, they kind of had to open up all the old wounds and scars that she has, and those are just there on the surface now. We also get Rachel reverting back to her normal streetwear, reasserting that Rachel is who she chooses to be and she is not that hound. The future didn't claim her and her trauma didn't win. I think this is a really emotionally impactful issue, and in fact I'm getting a little emotional about the issue, so it's getting a little harder to talk about. But I also really love the kind of resigned but meaningful, I love you people more than my life, I'll do whatever I have to protect you that we get from Rachel, because that is really the emotional beat of the whole issue. Despite the revenge that she wanted to enact, she chose her community over that. And she chose love over hate. And she puts aside her personal interpretation of what justice might be in the scenario in the hope of future collective justice for mutants at large. We then close with a nice little discussion between Kitty and Magneto, where Kitty asks him how he knew exactly what to say to Rachel, and he remarks that it's an easy task for one who, like Rachel, has dwelled too long in the valley of the shadow of death. And I think this is pretty important for Magneto too, just to see it from the other perspective, because he knows exactly what unchecked vengeance does to a person because he's lived it. And this is also pivotal for Kitty, who, if you will recall, in the beginning of the issue was pretty hesitant to have Magneto hanging around, but now she sees what she maybe didn't earlier, that there's compassion within him, there's wisdom within him, and maybe a new sense of moral clarity within him as well. I do really enjoy this issue as a story about one of the oldest dangers in the world, fear and hate, and the way that ordinary people can just radicalize themselves into believing violence is justified when the target they're after, they don't fully consider them human. Alright, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you on the next one.